All right, chapter 9, we are going to be talking about more essentials. So this time I'm covering water and different minerals. Right, as far as our learning outcomes, this is going to be somewhat similar to the vitamins. So as far as the minerals, knowing what their functions are, what happens whenever we don't have enough of them, too much of them, and where the different food sources are. But in addition, we're spending some extra time talking about water as far as their functions, what happens again with dehydration, with not enough, and even intoxication. As with our vitamins, the minerals have a large number of different functions, including water, so fluid and electrolyte balance, metabolism, so getting and using energy, bone health, growing and developing, our blood health, our neurological system, so how nerves communicate with each other, muscle contraction and relaxation, and our immunity. So water is, of course, essential for life. The most abundant molecule that we have, anywhere between 50 to 70% of our body is made up of water. Now we can lose water, and we'll talk more about this, but through our lungs, skin, urine being the most, and then feces as well, because we do not store water. It comes in and it goes out. It is not stored like we think about fats or proteins. So as body fat actually increases, the percent of lean tissue decreases, and also the total body water decreases. So the heavier we are, the less body water. So again, this range of 50 to 70 also depends on our percent of lean fat tissue. And then extremely lean athletes, again, they're going to have the most amount of water with that 70% complete 70% body water. All right, so if we look at some of the main constituents here as far as just where that is, again, 60% or so of water in most healthy males, 50%, close to 60 in women. So it's not that much difference between them. Again, then fat coming in below that, protein, minerals, and then our storage form of carbs, those glycogen molecules. Now, starting with water, lots of different functions of water. Of course, we know we're mainly made up of water. Why is it so important? So it's one of the main, of course, parts of our fluids, thinking about blood, also our waste products as far as urine and getting rid of metabolites and toxins. It helps regulate our temperature, distributing those nutrients through the blood, dissolving them. It's actually a lubricant, so we think about cartilage, needed for different reactions, for metabolism, and then also our acid-base balance. Now, water is a universal solvent, which just means it can dissolve other molecules. So it dissolves our carbs and our amino acids and some of the vitamins and that type of thing. So again, for the most part, dissolves most things. Of course, some are hydrophobic. They don't like water, so it wouldn't be a solvent in that case. But water is determined to be the universal solvent. It dissolves most things. So because of that, it can transport different nutrients and wastes because most of those are water soluble. It's the main component of our blood and our lymph, which is involved in transportation. And then again, those chemical reactions, such as going through metabolism to release energy, is a byproduct. Water gets made during those processes. So if we look at the transport of nutrients and wastes, so of course with proteins, we have that extra nitrogen that needs to get removed whenever it's metabolized. So that gets excreted as urea because it dissolves in water. So excess protein intake actually requires more water intake to help get rid of that extra nitrogen. Also sodium, we'll talk more about salt coming up, but excessive sodium consumption actually causes more sodium excretion, so that that output of urine increases because it's trying to dilute out that extra sodium. So ultimately, it depends on the intake of fluid, protein, and sodium to determine what that output is going to be. Now, temperature regulation is also dependent on our water because our body holds heat efficiently. Again, that 50 to 70% water, so it requires a lot of energy to change the body temperature. Water has what's called a high heat of evaporation, just meaning it can maintain the same temperature until large changes in temperature are applied. So it has to get really hot or really cold. Otherwise, it just kind of hangs out in the same temperature. So because we're mainly made up of water and because of that property, it takes large changes to affect our body temperature. It is a macronutrient because we need large amounts of it. And then also the releasing of energy. So whenever we're breaking down those fats and carbs and trying to make ATP, most of that energy, of course, about 40% is actually used for cells, but 60%, the majority is actually lost, is heat. So that helps warm the body. And that's why whenever you become overheated, so if you're exercising, of course, we sweat. And the reason for that perspiration is that through evaporation of the water on the skin, the water goes with, or the heat goes with the water, and that heat gets released with the water and it cools the body. So just a couple numbers here. So about a liter of evaporated sweat or perspiration is about 600 kilocalories of heat loss. So again, just kind of showing what's happening here. So again, releasing the heat. So if our body temperature is high, it's going to transport more blood out to the skin. So we become, again, kind of red. That's why our face gets really red whenever we are exercising. Again, we become very flushed because we're increasing the blood flow to the skin. It then evaporates to release that heat that's coming off of it. That helps cool the body. And then, of course, that flows back to the middle and helps decrease that body temperature by releasing some of that heat through the skin. All right, now water is also important as far as lubrication and cushioning. So in the saliva, of course, that helps pass the food from the esophagus to the stomach so that it doesn't just get stuck there because it's kind of dried out or clumped. The mucus we think about in our GI tract, again, helping to move things through the stomach and the intestines, but also the lungs, where it's trapping different bacteria to help get rid of those so they don't enter into this into our cells. Our cerebral spinal fluid, so it helps cushion and protect the spinal cord and the brain from different injuries by having that cushioning. Amniotic fluid around the baby or the fetus, again, is kind of a shock absorber to protect the baby. And then also in the joints and the knees, helps to lubricate those surfaces. And then, of course, our tears help lubricate our eyes to keep, again, bacteria from attaching, helps remove them, but also from drying out. So the water balance, if we think about our intake and outtake, so adequate intake is very important. Women need about 11 cups per day, 2.7 liters, men a little bit more, so 15 cups per day. As far as fluid alone, just kind of reduce 2 cups. So women need 9 cups of pure water or of water containing beverages, and then men need 13. The rest of it can come from our foods, but we need to consume the majority of it as actual fluid. But then different fruits, so fruits and vegetables are more than 80% water, so they can be good food sources for water. Meats, though, have some, but a little bit less, but still at least 50% water. So while our fruits and vegetables provide more, certainly our proteins do as well. All right, so just kind of estimating kind of this water balance. So again, water intake, so the fluids coming in, again, we need about 9 cups or so coming in. Again, a couple more cups from our food. And then water produced from metabolism gets made as well. Again, as we break down carbs to make ATP, water is a byproduct there. So we make some as we go through that. So that's our complete intake. Now our outputs, the majority is going to be released as urine. Again, about equivalent to what comes in as fluids. But also, again, sweating or perspiration is about what we get from our food. And then a little bit also gets released in our feces as well. All right, so that output, again, the urine is the greatest output, just kind of putting some numbers here. Again, about 8.5 cups. Below 500 milliliters, though, is a sign of dehydration. So again, a lack of urination is a sign of dehydration. Again, a little bit comes out in the feces, and some also through perspiration, through the skin, and then as well as our lungs. So water vapor that gets exhaled. Of course, we don't see it, it's in gas form, but that one's a little harder to measure. So how do we conserve the fluid? So that's the job really of our kidneys. For the most part, there are receptors there that detect changes in water balance, and they can signal that back. Our blood vessels and then the brain also are very important in maintaining our fluid balance. So blood pressure can increase or decrease based on our fluid intake or dehydration. And also the solutes in the blood help determine if water is coming into the blood or out. So we'll talk more about that coming up. And then some different hormones as far as the brain regulating this. So there's an antidiuretic hormone that gets released by the endocrine system. Angiotensin controls our blood pressure, and aldosterone also controls our water output. So all of those are ways the brain can regulate our water conservation. All right, so the antidiuretic hormone, this is secreted by the pituitary gland of the endocrine system, and this is whenever the blood solutes are really high. And again, we'll come back to osmosis here in a minute and talk about the significance of that in water. But ultimately, it tells the kidneys to reduce excretion, meaning releasing, so decreasing urine production, and that would increase the blood volume. So it puts more water back in the blood instead of producing more urine. Aldosterone is also a hormone, but it's released by the adrenal gland. This is whenever the blood volume is really low. So solutes will direct the antidiuretic. Blood volume, so how much blood we have, it will be activated, will activate the adrenal gland to release aldosterone. And this tells the kidneys to conserve the sodium in the water, which would then increase the blood volume. All right, so just looking here, so whenever we have blood or body fluids that are depleted, again, there are receptors that get activated in the hypothalamus. That's the main part of our endocrine system that regulates our hormones, and it sends a signal to the pituitary gland. The pituitary is going to release that antidiuretic hormone, and that tells the kidneys to retain more water, and that helps bring our water balance back. In addition to that, the kidneys also can sense a decrease in the blood flow, so not as much blood volume coming in. So then they activate a various signaling cascade that would involve angiotensin because of blood pressure, and also that aldosterone in the adrenal glands that are right here above the kidney. So those are going to change the reabsorption of sodium and chloride ions, and then that ultimately increases the retention of water in the kidneys. So both of those then are going to help increase or restore that fluid balance. So then dehydration here occurs whenever there's inadequate water intake, of course. So even just a small loss of 1 to 2%, which if we're talking about being made up of 50 to 70%, 1 or 2 really doesn't seem like a lot. So that is enough though to make us thirsty. Not until we get about 4% do we start actually feeling some effects. So we get tired, dizzy, the headache, one of the first kind of indicators. Once we get up to 10% loss though, that's whenever we have a decreased heat tolerance. So we're really hot or really cold. We start to get really weak, and that's indicating that sign of dehydration. So ultimately though, dehydration causes kidney failure, can cause, induce a coma and even death. And things that contribute to that are heat exhaustion, so again, which further decreases water because we're that perspiration, which can lead to heat stroke, but then also kidney stones are a player in that as well. All right, so kind of our path here to dehydration. So again, thirst does not really indicate dehydration. Again, that's only 1 or 2% that gets changed, so that's not dehydration yet. Now that stronger thirst, that starts to indicate there's something going on, about 2% of loss. Again, 4% is where we start seeing some issues like flushing of the skin, drowsiness, nausea. Up to 6% now our arms start to tingle, We have some stumbling and some headache. Again, heat exhaustion, so we're really tired and dizzy. Can't really control that temperature. Up to 8% now we're having a hard time breathing, which can decrease oxygen, so now we feel dizzy. Our speech starts getting kind of altered, increasingly weak, and some confusion going on as well. Then up to 10, this is where those muscle cramps really start coming into play. So we're not able to balance with our eyes closed. So again, we have this delirium or wakefulness, swollen tongue, circulatory problems. So again, this is where we start to see those kidneys starting to fail though. And then if it gets more than 10%, this is where that risk of death starts to become an issue. All right, so urine production, we typically produce about 1 liter or so. So half of that, so 500 milliliters the urine becomes concentrated, and it puts a lot of work on our kidneys. So that's whenever we start getting concerned. So a way to determine that there's enough fluid, so most of us don't really measure out our urine output, but a good way, just some indicators here, is the color. So a clear yellow color indicates good hydration. There's plenty of fluid in there. Dark yellow and very strong odor indicates poor hydration, that more water is needed to help dilute out those solutes. All right, so just kind of a little indicator here. So again, the darker we get, the more alarmed we want to be. So again, a nice pale yellow here indicates we're good. As it starts to get a little darker, and then of course very dark indicates immediate fluids that are needed. All right, so the opposite is also possible though. So overhydration or toxicity of water. So this is whenever the water intake exceeds the kidney's ability just to process it. So sodium becomes diluted in the blood, and that leads to this water toxicity or even hyponatremia. So this is actually a potentially fatal condition. So water can become toxic. Again, it occurs with very high intakes of water, and essentially what's happening is the blood becomes so diluted that we're diluting out some of these minerals like sodium. So this causes swelling of the brain, the nerves, again, fluids, because the kidneys can't possibly keep up with it. So that water has to go somewhere, and it gets concentrated again around the brain and the nerves as well as in the lungs. So essentially we're kind of drowning in that fluid. All right, so we're going to take just a quick second here to talk about bottled water, and really a misconception that it's better than tap water. So first of all, there's a huge industry out there for bottled water and the amount that's consumed. Now, the bottled water processing is actually just reprocessed tap water. So despite all the pretty pictures of a stream and springs and all that kind of stuff, it's really just reprocessed tap water that you would get out of your sink. But that extra packaging, though, to make the plastic for the bottled water, though, over time, those plastics break down, and it's very detrimental to the environment. Not the water, not the processing, but the extra plastic really is the concern. So there are lots of standards for the quality for both bottle and tap. So just because it's bottled doesn't mean it went through more regulations. It's the same as what it was for tap water. And again, that processing, usually it's the same as just kind of filtering it out so that it doesn't taste as chlorine or some of the chemicals that are added to process it. They're still there. It just, you're losing that taste, and the bottled water is kind of the misconception that it's healthier. But those aren't actually healthier. So again, environmentally, it causes a lot of problems because of the extra plastics that it's putting into the environment with no benefit as far as health-wise to us. All right, so then just kind of looking the sustainable solutions, again, thinking about the environment here a bit. So again, tap water just goes through the pipes of our home. However, bottled water, we need that extra packaging. It's more costly because we have to package the water into the containers and then distribute it instead of just putting it through a pipe. So again, the concern are the energy used for both of those. Again, poor recycling, and even the recycling isn't 100%. That solid waste disposal of that, again, the boatloads of plastic needed to make that water, again, billions of gallons of water being consumed, which means the plastic is needed for all of that. So eliminating the use of disposable plastic water bottles by using reusable bottles. And we're starting to see more of a surge of this, like Stanley's and all these different companies coming up with cool water bottles. But again, the good thing about them is that they're helping to decrease the need for plastic bottles. Again, stainless steel, again, the Stanley that's what it is. And then also wide mouth is really good for cleaning so that you're keeping them nice and clean and you can properly wash them. All right, so back to water in our cells. So we need to take just a little bit here to talk about these electrolytes and the movement of water. So electrolytes are just ions that are dissolved in water. So some are positively charged, some are negatively charged. The reason we're talking about them though is that the ion concentration controls how much water we have inside the cell, intracellular versus outside or extracellular. So again, these electrolytes are just charged ions that transfer electric current. So the primary extracellular ions, the ones found outside of our cells, are sodium and chlorine. So we have a positive and a negative. And the primary ones inside of the cell are potassium and phosphate that makes up our DNA. So again, another positive and negative ion there. Again, the importance of these, as we'll see as we go through each of these different minerals, which a lot of them are also electrolytes, is that it controls whether water is coming in or out of our cells. So that process of moving water is referred to as osmosis, which is just the movement of water across a membrane from a less concentrated compartment to a more concentrated compartment. So this is used by the digestive tract to absorb water. So this is what determines whether water is being excreted or absorbed in the colon. So is it going out through the feces or is it being reabsorbed into the small intestine or into the colon? The large intestine or the colon. All right, so with osmosis, we have a couple terms here to talk about. Isotonic is whenever there are equal concentrations of solutes. So between the inside and outside of the cell, they have equal concentrations of these electrolytes or these solutes. Hypotonic is whenever there's a lower concentration. So if there are less solutes in the blood than in the cell, we say the blood is hypotonic. And then hypertonic is the solution with more. So again, if we are using an example here of our blood, and then we have our red blood cell, if there is a lot of solute, just on these little dots here, that are in the cell versus in the blood, then because it's more concentrated in the cell, we say that the cell is hypertonic, and then in this case the blood would be hypotonic. And what's going to happen is water moves from a hypotonic solution, again a lower concentration, less concentrated, to a more concentrated as far as solutes. So in this case, what's going to happen is that water is going to move into the cell, trying to dilute out all those extra solutes that are in there. All right, and this is showing ultimately what happens to the cells. So in animal cells in an isotonic solution, water is still moving. It's just not overall gaining or losing as far as its volume. So the cell is maintaining, so it's the same on the inside and outside. So again, that's what we want in our blood. We want our blood and the inside of our cells to be isotonic because there's no net water movement. However, if our cells are placed in a hypotonic solution, meaning the blood now is diluted, like the illustration that I just showed. If it's in a hypotonic solution, now the concentration of solutes is greater inside the cell than outside. So in order to reach equilibrium, water is going to come in, and as water comes in, that cell is going to swell. And eventually, with red blood cells, they can only hold so much, just like a balloon. So eventually, if enough comes in, it's going to explode, which is what this is trying to illustrate and that causes what's called hemolysis, or the lysing of blood cells. And then the opposite, if something happens and the inside of the cell becomes, or sorry, the blood becomes hypertonic, meaning there's more solute outside of the cell. So again, that solute concentration is greater outside. Now what's going to happen is that the water is going to flow out of the cell and it's going to shrink. And if it's very small, like we're seeing down here, then it's not going to be able to work. So again, water is moving out of the cell in this situation. So our cells, we need to maintain this isotonic environment between the blood, or the outside of the cell, and the inside. All right, so if we just kind of hit the highlights here with our minerals. So first of all, minerals are just individual chemical elements that cannot be broken down any further. So they are essential when our dietary inadequacies cause physiological or structural abnormalities. And then we can, if we add them back, it restores. So again, essential nutrients, essential minerals. Essential just means if we don't have it, something bad happens to our body. And if we put that molecule back, then we restore the function. So that's what it means to be essential. Again, our body cannot make these minerals. We have to take them in our diet, and we have to have them. Now, there are a few different types based on the amount that we need. So major minerals, we need 100 milligrams or more a day. Trace, we need some, but less than 100 milligrams. And then ultra trace just indicates that these are not essential to human health. So they are not needed in enough supply that we could, we have to have them. We could go without the ultra trace. Now, there are a lot of minerals in this chapter. We are only going to focus on the major, and then also iron, which is one of the trace, but it's a very significant one. So we are going to talk about the major and then the iron from the trace. So we're not covering all the ones in this chapter. So only the ones we talk about are what you'll be tested on. All right, and this is just kind of looking at an overview here. So the mineral that we need the most of, as you can see here, is calcium, then phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chloride, and magnesium. Again, iron is one of the trace, but we are still going to talk about it because of its significance to our health. But again, of the minerals we're talking about, calcium is the one we need to consume the most of. Now, as with vitamins, we can't have too much. So mineral toxicities, this is mainly only whenever we have supplements that are providing more than 100% of that daily value. And mainly the harm here is based on interactions with other nutrients and preventing them from working. So it's not so much that having too much iron or too much calcium is necessarily bad by itself, but it can inhibit other nutrients from being absorbed or from working. And as with our vitamins, that USP symbol that stands for United States Pharmacopeal Convention just indicates a better quality, that there has been some research, some idea about the efficacy, kind of like our ADA on our dental products. So again, if you're using supplements, make sure you check for that USP on the label. All right, so starting with our first one is sodium that we're going to talk about. So first of all, table salt is made up of sodium chloride. So we'll talk about this with sodium here, and then we'll come back to it with chloride. So actually most of it is chloride. Only 40% of table salt is sodium. But 1 teaspoon of salt, which we don't necessarily typically consider a whole lot, is 2,400 milligrams of sodium, which is a lot. It is very abundant in our food supply, and without a doubt, Americans overall exceed the requirement. So here we're not as much concerned about a deficiency in sodium. We're more concerned about an abundance of sodium in the diet that causes potential health risk. So why do we need sodium? First of all, it helps to maintain that fluid balance. So again, it's one of the electrolytes that determines whether water is coming in or out of the cells, setting up that isotonic environment. It's also really important for how our nerves communicate. So what's called an action potential gets released. And in order for that to happen, for one neuron to communicate with another, sodium rushes into the cell. So without sodium, our nerves aren't going to function properly. And it also helps absorb some different nutrients like glucose and some others. And then these blood levels actually vary only slightly whenever it comes to sodium. Right, so if we do have a deficiency, those at risk here are those on a low sodium diet where it's maybe a little too low. Excessive sweating though, because again, trying to release that heat, sodium goes with the water as we go through perspiration. So if we sweat too much, not only do we become dehydrated, but we're losing our sodium. Also persistent vomiting and diarrhea, again, just that sodium going with the water that's coming out either end there. And the symptoms of that include muscle cramps, so similar to our dehydration. It can actually cause nausea and vomiting, dizziness, can go into shock, and ultimately even a coma. Again, typically the issue we talk about, at least in the American diet with sodium, is not having enough, but having too much. So this is one that falls under the CDRR, the Chronic Disease Risk Reduction. This is newly added to that DRI, so that restricted intake that we need to have, because overuse of this is tied to chronic disease. So trying to reduce our sodium intake is really important because some of the chronic diseases we're talking about here are cardiovascular disease, especially hypertension or high blood pressure. And if you're not real familiar with blood pressure, there's a systolic blood pressure and a diastolic blood pressure, and this can impact both of them. Systolic is the high number, diastolic is the low number. In addition, though, to heart health or heart issues, again, reducing that sodium intake can also help maintain our calcium levels. Okay, because sodium intake more than 2,000 milligrams a day actually causes calcium to be lost. So again, as the urine is trying to dilute out and get rid of the sodium, calcium goes with it. So it can lead to calcium deficiencies. All right, so the reasons that we need to avoid bringing in too much sodium is, again, that with more sodium, we get an increase of urine output. That can cause dehydration. The loss of water also decreases our blood volume, so it leads to hypertension or high blood pressure. And there is a link between too much salt and obesity or becoming overweight. So that chronic disease prevention kind of recommendation here is to consume less than about 2,300 milligrams per day. And if you remember back, that's only a teaspoon per day was 2,000 milligrams. So again, significantly reducing our sodium intake. So that is expected to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure. So especially if those run in your family genetically, it's really important to limit that sodium intake because about 95% of North Americans have a sodium intake that exceeds that 2,300 that puts us at risk for those chronic diseases. So in order to know how to decrease it, we need to know where it is. Well, the majority, so about 77% of sodium in the food is from food processing or at restaurant meals. So again, eating at home more often, not eating fast food or highly processed foods. So cooking your own foods is a great way to decrease our sodium intake because they use so much of it in the food industry and especially processing like canned foods. So also about 5% or so is what we add whenever we cook at home. So again, much less than the 77% that's in the restaurant meals. Again, added to food at the table just as we're increasing kind of the taste of it. And then about 12% is naturally in the food. So again, if we can really decrease this area of eating those processed foods or eating out so much, that's one way to significantly decrease our sodium intake. All right, so then those sources of food, again, naturally found in about 12% of the sodium comes naturally in foods. So those though with high sodium, so again, those packaged processed foods, again, fast foods, also canned foods, the salt's added to preserve it, and even prepared frozen meals like pizzas or like the different boxed meals that come that are frozen. So the frozen meals, struggled with that one. Again, they have a lot of salt for that preservation and also helping it taste a little better to mask that they don't taste that good. So again, avoiding those with lower sodium foods. So again, these naturally have the salt in them. They're not added salt. So our fruits and vegetables, whole grains, meats without sauces, and then unprocessed foods are better to consume. There are actually a few different types of salt out there. So just a little aside here about the different types. So just regular table salt. This is mined from the earth. It's processed into those fine grains. It can be precisely measured, and it's usually fortified with iodine, and iodine deficiencies can cause problems related to like thyroid problems and goiters that can occur. There's also kosher salt. This is more of a coarse grain instead of the fine grain like our table salt. So these are large grains that you can see. The name comes from the role of koshering, which means curing or pickling. And then sea salt is made from evaporating seawater. It's also kind of coarse like the kosher, but it's a little bit flakier. So that creates these tiny little explosions of salt flavor whenever they're consumed. And there are some trace minerals, colors, and even flavor variations that are available with those. So whenever we're consuming salt, these are the ones that are best to consume.